Okay, yesterday there's some confusion, but the president's body's back on the airplane. General Godfrey McHugh, who's a military aide to Kennedy, is insisting that the plane be taken off as soon as the president's body's on. That hasn't happened. He's concerned about safety because he thinks there could be a conspiracy. He doesn't even know that Johnson is on the airplane. He thinks he's flying back on a different plane. Mrs. Kennedy's trying to get him to go because she's had enough, frankly, and it's so doggone hot in the airplane because the air conditioning units have been disconnected and it's just miserable. And so when McHugh goes to James Swindoll and asks him why the plane hasn't taken off, he said that Vice President Johnson hasn't given the okay. And again, McHugh didn't even know Johnson was on the airplane. And the reason why the plane hadn't taken off and that Johnson didn't order it to leave is he wanted to be sworn in as President of the United States on Air Force One before it departed back home. He did not want a presidentless country. Okay, now here's where it gets interesting. Vice President Johnson actually called Bobby Kennedy back in Virginia to talk about whether he should take the oath of office before they left or not. He had a conversation with Bobby Kennedy. And here's how the kind of conversation went. You can write down what you think you need to. Vice President Johnson asked Bobby, who can administer the oath? And what are the constitutional requirements concerning the oath? He really, didn't know for sure. And Bobby Kennedy is the Attorney General, right? So Bobby listens to Vice President Johnson asking those questions on who could administer the oath and what was the constitutional requirements concerning the oath. He said, I'll check on it and get back to you. Okay, that was the conversation thus far. Now, what does that tell you? If he took the time to call Bobby Kennedy and ask him that, what is Vice President Johnson really looking for from Bobby Kennedy?
Okay.
The okay or permission. He wants his blessing, okay? He wants Bobby involved. So there wasn't any doubt that Vice President Johnson wanted Bobby's permission to take the oath in Dallas, okay? Now, Johnson insisted that the idea of taking the oath came from the Attorney General. And he wanted that decision to be Bobby Kennedy's. And he even told Kennedy personnel on the aircraft, quote, Bobby wants me to take the oath in Dallas. So Johnson not only wants Bobby Kennedy's permission, he wants to make sure this is Bobby Kennedy's idea that he do it. Because he doesn't want to alienate the Kennedy forces on the airplane. Does that make sense? Okay? Because they're wanting to get the hell out of there. Especially Jackie. Okay? Now, it's kind of interesting because when everything comes to a head at the end, Bobby Kennedy insisted it was Johnson's idea that he take the oath in Dallas. So, when Johnson made it sound like it was his idea, it really alienated Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy supporters from Johnson. So Johnson kind of, I don't know what his thought process was in a way. He wanted Bobby's permission. He wanted it to be Bobby's idea. And he portrayed it to everybody on the airplane that it was Bobby's idea that he take the oath of office before the plane took off. When Bobby was later talked to about it, he disagreed. He said it was not my idea. It was Lyndon's idea to take the oath of office. And this really would later cause some issues between the new president and the Attorney General and Kennedy supporters in general. Well, after getting permission, at least in his mind he had permission from Bobby, Vice President Johnson called a guy by the name of Irving Goldberg. Irving Goldberg. Irving Goldberg. Okay, called him. And Irving Goldberg was a friend of Johnson's, and he was also a strong political advisor of Johnson's. And he asked him, who can swear me in? We're sitting here in Dallas. We got to get this swearing in done before we take off. So he calls his longtime friend and political advisor, Irving Goldberg, and he says, who could swear me in here? Who's able to do that? Do you think Goldberg knows that? No. So what do you think he does? He would probably then call somebody to get that information. So once Johnson called Irving Goldberg and asked him who could swear him in, Goldberg then called a United States attorney by the name of Barefoot Sanders. Barefoot Sanders. And I've got a signature up here of him. And that's what he went with by, Barefoot Sanders. Okay? So Goldberg calls an attorney, United States attorney, Barefoot Sanders, and asks him who can swear the vice president in. Well, Barefoot Sanders knew the rules or knew the procedure, and he said that any federal judge could administer the oath of office. Okay? So Goldberg calls U.S. Attorney Barefoot Sanders, asks him who can swear Vice President Johnson in as the new President of the United States, and Sanders informs him that any federal judge could do that. So what does Johnson tell Goldberg to do when he gets that information? Find a federal judge. Okay? So Goldberg informs the vice president that a federal judge could administer the oath, and so Johnson then tells Goldberg to find a federal judge. So he got on the phone and he got a hold of one who was actually at home. So they're waiting for what now? Federal judge to arrive. So Johnson tells Irving Goldberg to find a federal judge. He does. He reaches one by home and asks the judge to come to Love Field aboard Air Force One. In the meantime, Johnson goes to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin in the airplane to express his sorrow about the assassination of her husband. So after Johnson gets this oath of office in motion, he then goes to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin in the airplane to express his sorrow. And he takes his wife with him, Lady Bird Johnson. So the vice president and his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, went to Mrs. Kennedy's cabin to express their sorrow about the loss of her husband. Now, according to Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Kennedy's dress was stained with blood. Her right glove was stained with blood. Her nylons were stained with blood. She hadn't changed her clothes at all from the time of the assassination. She simply went back and got on Air Force One with never a thought of changing her clothes. So there's Mrs. Kennedy standing there in the same clothes she wore in the limousine, which are stained with the president's blood, brain matter, and everything else. Well, Mrs. Johnson understood that Mrs. Kennedy probably was still a little bit in shock, and Mrs. Johnson suggested to Mrs. Kennedy that she might want to kind of clean up prior to the swearing in of her husband, because they're going to ask her to be a witness to it. So Mrs. Johnson, in a very polite and hospitable way, kind of suggests to Jackie that, Jackie, maybe you might want to clean up. She hasn't washed her face or anything. I mean, she's no different than she was when she got out of the limousine. And Mrs. Johnson is trying to be kind and says, Mrs. Kennedy, do you want to change clothes, maybe clean up before this swearing in? Mrs. Kennedy politely refused, stating, quote, I want them to see what they have done to Jack. I want them to see what they have done to Jack. She refused to change her clothes because she wanted the country to see what they, in her mind, had done to her husband. So she does not clean up. She refuses, stating, I want them to see what they have done to Jack. Which had to be a little uncomfortable for all. Well, at 12:38 p.m., Vice President Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard Air Force One by federal judge Sarah T. Hughes.
That was at 12:38.
2:30, sorry, 2:38. Help me out here. At 2:38 p.m., Vice President Johnson was sworn in as the 36th President of the United States aboard Air Force One by federal judge Sarah T. Hughes. Here's a picture of Sarah T. Hughes right here. Sarah T. Hughes. 2:38. Now this is interesting because she was only 2 years into her tenure as a federal district judge, and here she is swearing in a United States president. That would be very unusual to serve as a federal judge in Texas and in the Dallas area and be called at home to swear in a new president. So she was not an experienced really federal district judge. She'd only been in the job a couple of years, and here she is center stage on Air Force One swearing in Lyndon Johnson. Now, the famous photograph of Johnson being sworn in that I gave you, that you probably need to get out and kind of have in front of you, was taken by Cecil Stoughton, who was the official White House photographer. So this famous picture that I gave you, that you're going to need here in a few minutes of the swearing in, was taken by Cecil Stoughton, who was the official White House photographer. All the pictures you see of the Kennedy children in the White House that Jackie really didn't authorize, or all the pictures that were taken of the president during his presidential reign, all were taken by Cecil Stoughton. He was the White House photographer, and he took this very famous picture that we're going to talk about in a minute of Vice President Johnson being sworn in. A kind of interesting story about Stoughton. He was handpicked by the President and Mrs. Kennedy to become the White House photographer, and he was the first ever White House photographer ever in our country, a position that has been filled ever since as a standard position for presidents. So Kennedy not only was the one that revamped Air Force One the way we see it today, he and Mrs. Kennedy, he also was the person that hired the first White House photographer, Cecil Stoughton, which became a tradition for every president thereafter. Okay? So let's look at our picture and I'll tell you who's in it. I've got numbers there so you can do it however you'd like. It's kind of interesting who's there, some of the people we've talked about. Find the guy at number 1. You see the guy at number 1? Bottom left-hand corner? That's Malcolm Kilduff. Malcolm Kilduff. Does anybody remember who Malcolm Kilduff was? See what your retention is. Who is Malcolm Kilduff? Now, one person in here knows who that is. Malcolm Kilduff. Any idea? What did Malcolm Kilduff do? We got all period. Nope. You can look in your notes. Who's Malcolm Kilduff? He'll be on your semester test, I'll guarantee it. Malcolm Kilduff. Who is he? Why would he be in the picture? Who the hell is he? Anybody? He's on your ID sheet, and if you kind of follow your ID sheet to your notes, you might find him.
He's not on the first one.
He's not? Or was he on the one before that?
Yeah, he's a,
Shh, here we go. Go ahead, Emery.
Assistant Press Secretary.
And what did he do?
He announced the death of President Kennedy.
Yeah, very good. Malcolm Kilduff was the associate or assistant press secretary. He was the man that officially announced the death of the president back at Parkland Hospital. Now, you can't see very well, but you see that little gadget or that hand in front of number 2's mouth? You see that thing? That's a dictaphone. And what it is, it's recording what Sarah Hughes is saying for historic purposes. And Malcolm Kilduff felt this was something that needed to be preserved for history. So he took a dictaphone from the airplane and recorded what she said. Obviously, who's number 2? Sarah T. Hughes, federal judge who swore in Vice President Johnson. Some of these people we'll have talked about, some not. Okay? Now remember, this is an open note test. So, okay, number 3 is a new person in our history. Should be on your ID sheet. Jack Valente. Jack Valente. You see him there? Kind of peering in, number 3. Now his position at the time is he was in the president's cabinet, so to speak. He was a liaison between the president and the news media during the trip to Dallas. He was not a press secretary. He simply worked with the media on behalf of the president during his trip to Dallas. That's why he's there, to be a liaison, a go-between between the president and the media during the president's trip to Dallas. Okay, that's what his job was, and that's why he would happen to be in the picture. He was the guy that was the go-between or the liaison between the media and President Kennedy during his trip to Dallas. He later became a special assistant to soon to be President Johnson. So he's going to be an advisor for President Johnson during his presidency. But at the time, he was served as a liaison with the news media during the president's trip to Dallas. Anybody want to guess who number 4 is, the way he's dressed up and we've talked about him? Who might he be? You know him from Houston in the payload payroll. Who is number 4? Albert Thomas. Remember, he's the man that President Kennedy spoke at his appreciation dinner on November 21st, 63, when he made the comment, we'll have the biggest payroll, payload. He's the congressman, not a senator, congressman, representative. That's Albert Thomas, who he spoke in behalf of in Houston, number 4. Now, number 5 is kind of hard to see. It's a lady with her eyes looking down over his shoulders. She's got kind of a dew curl there in the front of her hair. You can see her eyes looking down. You can't see her real well. But that is Marie Femmer. Marie Femmer. You see that number 5 there? It's kind of a head looking down with 2 eyes looking at you. Marie Femmer. And Marie Femmer, her position at this time is she was the personal secretary to Vice President Johnson. She was the personal secretary of Vice President Johnson. Marie Femmer. Personal secretary to Vice President Johnson. Can you see her there very good? Just all you can see is her eyes head down the blue curl there. Who is 6? Lady Bird Johnson. Very good. Lady Bird Johnson, 6. We'll tell you how she got that name later. Lady Bird Johnson. Obviously, 7 is Lyndon Johnson. Who is 8? Jackie Kennedy. Now 9 is kind of hard. All you can see is the top of his white hair. But I do have a picture of him here. This is this fellow right here. This is another picture after the oath was done. That's Homer Thornberry. Okay? Number 9, all you can see is the top of his head, was Homer Thornberry. And he was appointed to the United States District Court in Texas by President Kennedy in 1963. He was appointed to the United States District Court for Texas in 1963. So what was his job? He was a judge, district judge. Oh, could he swear in? No. So Homer Thornberry actually was a former congressman from Texas, but he had been appointed by President Kennedy to a seat on the United States District Court for Texas in 1963. So he was there as well. You can't see anything at the top of his head. I do have a picture of him over there. Now 10 is very difficult. All you can see is her glasses from her right eye as she looks like she'd be looking kind of right in Jackie Kennedy's ear. So all you can see is her glasses and black hair. Can you kind of pick that up? Very hard to see. That is Evelyn Lincoln. Who is Evelyn Lincoln? Kennedy's personal secretary. That's Evelyn Lincoln. You can't see her very well, but she was there. Evelyn Lincoln is number 10. Who do you think number 11 is back there? You can see one eye, left eye, kind of baldish head. His pictures come out quite a bit, and he was very instrumental in this whole thing. Roy Kellerman, Secret Service agent, head of the Secret Service, protecting the president, the man that really made the decision to take his body away from Parkland and violating Texas state law. So 11 is Roy Kellerman, who was the Secret Service agent in charge of the agents there. Okay, 12. You can see a little bit more. 12. His name is Lem Johns. Lem Johns. And he was a Secret Service agent also assigned to Vice President Johnson. Lem Johns. Secret Service agent that was assigned to Vice President Johnson. That's 12. What can you see in 13? What can you pick out with 13? You can see a right eye, right, the kind of a nose. That was Pamela Tunyer. Pamela Tunyer. She was a personal assistant to President Kennedy. Or excuse me, personal assistant to Jackie Kennedy, but rumored to have had an affair with President Kennedy. That was kind of like scuttlebutt after the president was assassinated. So Pamela Tunyer was a personal assistant to Jackie Kennedy, who later was rumored to have had an affair with the president. So we'll talk more about that later. He was kind of a philanderer, so to speak. Pamela Tunyer. 14, pretty easy to see, 14, Jack Brooks. Jack Brooks. Looked like a pretty young guy. He was a congressman from Texas who eventually served 42 years in the House. So he was a young congressman then. He eventually served 42 years in the House of Representatives representing Texas. That was Jack Brooks, number 14. Congressman from Texas who eventually served 42 years in the House. He was in the motorcade during the assassination. He was one of the congressmen in that long motorcade, one of the cars. 15. You can only see kind of the top of his head. That fellow was Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers. And he was a journalist. He eventually would serve as White House press secretary from 65 to 67. Under who? Johnson and Nixon? Yep.
During when?
Well, not really Nixon, just Johnson.
During when?
He was the press secretary from 65 to 67.